This talk is a brief look at some of the specimens I have come across and drawn in a number of different museum collections. It's a subjective rather than academic approach, and I pass no judgments on the collections that house them or the visitors that view them. I am, after all, one of the latter, and admit to finding myself sometimes conflicted when drawn to displays of human remains. This skull is part of a box of human remains I found in the archaeology store of Ipswich Museum. There is a card in the box noting that it was found in a cider orchard and a scrap of paper with the words, "Probably Roman." During the time that I spent with her, I came to ascertain that she was probable female, and I drew her many times, considering these drawings as portraits of her as she is now, many centuries after death, while wondering how she came to be in this country, this county, then an orchard, then a box in a museum store. But while the collection and storage of Roman remains is not uncommon, nor particularly contentious, archaeology as opposed to anthropology, predating the colonial fascination for collecting otherness, she stands as a silent witness to the changing nature of collections of human remains, where they originate, where they end up, and, perhaps, why. The Hunterian Museum in London's Royal College of Surgeons was built around the collection of anatomist John Hunter in 1799. In terms of contentious specimens, the best known in the Hunterian is likely the skeleton of Charles Byrne, known as the Irish Giant. But I want to talk about a rather smaller skeletal preparation. Many years ago I spent some time drawing this, skull of a young boy with a second imperfect skull attached to its anterior fontanelle. Afterwards, I thoughtlessly posted the drawing online, and an academic friend asked me if it was a two-headed boy of Bengal. I thought of it only as specimen P1535, but her research produced in short order evidence that it is in fact the remains of the child mentioned, and that there are images of him made while he was alive, and it was only then that I came to ponder his short life and sad death, and the macabre events that led to his little head, removed from his little dead shoulders, making the journey from India to London, to end up in a cabinet next to an equally bizarre, deformed calf. Scientifically, this is a fascinating specimen. It is the first known documented case of Craniopagus parasiticus, where a parasitic twin head with an undeveloped body is attached to the head of a developing twin. Fewer than a dozen cases have been documented, and fewer still surviving birth. In 2 modern cases, where a separation was attempted, both died of brain infection. The Hunterian's online catalogue offers this information. You can see that at this time teratologies were simply described as monsters, and there is a fair selection in their catalogue. And the autobiographical information, which I know is too much to read here, notes firstly the physical attributes of the teratology, and then a brief summary of the boy's short life, which does not reflect well on either midwife or parents, who are likely impoverished. I became interested in the missing information, of how this child's head entered the museum in the first place, and this is what came to fascinate me. Soon after the boy was buried, a Mr. Dent, agent of the East India Company, robbed his grave. His corpse was dissected, then putrefied, and his skull was presented to English surgeon Everard Home, who presumably then passed it on to John Hunter. The Hunterian is currently undergoing a major redevelopment, and I've not been able to ascertain whether the unnamed boy of Bengal is going back on display when it reopens in 2023. I am also still coming to terms with my own lack of empathy. To have seen the wonder and beauty and fascination of the abnormal, the gorgeous aesthetic of remains made fantastic by their pathology, and not to have wondered at the life of the child before me. Now, the Pitt Rivers Museum, like the Hunterian, is based on the collection of one man. It was founded in 1884, when General Pitt Rivers, an influential figure in the development of archaeology and evolutionary anthropology, gave his collection to the University of Oxford. This collection originated from an interest in weaponry, but spread to include the archaeological and ethnographic objects for which the museum, in my opinion, is better known. My earlier visits to this collection always began at the cabinet called Treatment of Dead Enemies, which included their collection of sansas, or shrunken heads, as well as Naga trophy heads such as these. On my last visit, however, it was the serenity and reverence emanating from an adjacent case titled simply Treatment of the Dead, that drew my attention. This particular subject was collected in the Solomon Islands by an unknown sailor and was donated to the museum in 1900 by a later owner. The catalogue description is shown here. And I confess it was this mysterious covering that drew me to it. Obscuring the features of the skull's face, those knots and discs of shell, only covering the front, spoke of skill, patience, and a reverence for its subject which I found powerfully attractive. I've seen many ancestor heads in world culture exhibits, all equally compelling, but none which radiated this complexity and contradictory calmness. Since its reopening in September last year, the Pitt Rivers has made a number of changes, informed by a 3-year expansive ethical review of its displays. Acutely aware of their colonial legacy, their review acts as a framework for the process of decolonization, from physical objects to historical labeling. More than simply taking problematic specimens off display, they are engaging with local community delegates, indigenous leaders, the university of which they are a department, and stakeholders from across the world. Their new interpretations offer insights into how the collection was formed, including the problematic use of physical anthropology to support racial stereotyping. A key outcome of their review was the removal of human remains from public display. I find myself conflicted at this process. As a mixed-race person, I feel an ever-present mixture of fascination and sadness when viewing the skulls of peoples from regions that make up part of my own ancestry. So this drawing will remain forever unfinished, and I must be content with that. So now let me take you across the pond, to the College of Physicians in Philadelphia, home of the Mütter Museum. This subject caught my eye during my first residency at the museum in 2011. It's not on public display, but in cold storage in the wet room, where their fluid specimens are kept and conserved. I was struck by several notions. It is a sagittal section of a human head, which in itself isn't uncommon in medical collections, but it is plainly African-American, the first I'd come across in my museum travels. The sagittal cut is neat and clean, but in contrast the eye has been crudely enucleated. What gave me an emotional connection to him, however, was the scatter of tiny whiteheads on his cheek, and the little tufts of stubble on his weak chin. At that time he was labelled simply 2005-1.head, a temporary accession number, as they were organising their collections. And when I returned in 2020, this was the first specimen that I wanted to visit. I was struck again by his facial features, and by the visual distortion caused by the heavy glass of the squared jar. Looking at it from an angle, the front right corner of the jar facing towards you, you can see both sides of him. The medical gaze admires the information thus presented, showing the brain, upper spinal cord, tongue, and sinus cavities. However, the social construct of this uniquely recognizable face offers a contrast to the anatomy within. The blurring caused by the corner of the jar creates a border where the inner and outer are dissolved, simultaneously separating and merging. During my visit, the Mütter went into lockdown, a day ahead of all the other museums in Philadelphia. Their exhibition at the time, Spit Spreads Death, concerned the 1918-19 flu pandemic, and they were keen to set an example, as in 1918 parades and mass gatherings in the city went ahead, and Philadelphia had the highest death rate of any major city in America. For me, head became a perfect metaphor for this time, both in the sense of its interstitial state between the medical and social gaze, and in the fact that certain social classes and races are disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Head now has a proper museum accession number, and I have learnt that he was one of 3 specimens donated to the Mütter by the Worcester Museum. Their catalogue has only the information shown here. The location of the other 2 loans remains unknown. Although the Worcester Institute is still in existence, its museum closed many years ago, and I've not been able to glean any more information than this. So Head remains in the cool of the wet room until the next time I'm able to visit him. Although I saw no other African-American remains in the Mütter, it is worth noting here that there are a considerable number of black bodies in many American museums, a fact highlighted in an article from April this year. That's not to say that this specimen has a contentious provenance, but it is possible that he was collected without permission. One only has to examine the history of Henrietta Lacks to see this process at work in relatively recent times. So I'm going to end by returning to Ipswich Museum, a small museum in the county town of Suffolk. It boasts a mixed collection that includes a beautiful Victorian natural history gallery and an enviable Egyptology collection, occasioned by their funding several of Flinders Petrie's expeditions. It has also a large empire collection, given to the museum after their owners retired to Suffolk from the colonies. They have this year embarked on a decolonisation strategy, informed by research carried out by Dr. Yasmin Khan. Dr. Khan has identified an approach that is not unnecessarily antagonistic, but at the same time, nor is it tokenistic or short-term. Ipswich is a vibrantly multicultural city, and the museum will be working with community curators to create previously untold narratives for their new interpretations. Unsurprisingly, the collection contains objects with a sometimes contentious history and includes human remains such as this skull of an Isabel Islander. The skull has been over-modelled with the features of its original owner and carefully decorated with carved shell. One of the things I was hoping to accomplish by painting it was to treat it as a portrait of the man. On reflection, though, even this practice might occupy a culturally unethical zone. Would a man from this culture want such a thing? Would it be considered offensive? Not as offensive, perhaps, as being put on public display. And this head, along with other human remains, has been taken out of its glassy communal case to a quieter, darker resting place in the stores. Their World Cultures curator, Melanie Hollis, takes a three-pronged approach to the objects under her care, asking, is it stolen, sacred, or secret? Some objects on display are, for example, only meant to be seen by certain members of a community, or used in specific ceremonies not intended to be shared or shown. Many of the items in their collection, as with the Pitt rivers, were bought from dealers. These include a ritual cannibal fork and related bowls that were alleged to have been used in the consumption of a missionary called Reverend Baker in 1867. The unfortunate Reverend, having offended the chief, had the honour of being the only missionary actually eaten by cannibals in Fiji, on the island of Viti Levu. The ethics of their display here is up for debate, although it should be noted that conversely, the rock that killed the missionary, and the soles of his sandals, are still on display in Fiji. However, in 2003, the descendants of these islanders offered a public apology and ritual of reconciliation to those of Reverend Baker. Each collection makes its own decisions about what they choose to put on public display or not. Decolonisation is, in practice, more complex than simply removing such things from display, and it has been in slow progress for decades. It's worth noting that the Hunterian in Glasgow, based on the collection of John Hunter's brother William, has appointed a curator of discomfort to find new ways of interpreting contested or sensitive collections. Zandra Yeaman, on a secondment from the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, says about her role, museums are beginning to understand their complicity in perpetuating ideologies centered on white cultural superiority. A curator's role is evolving. As the curator of discomfort, I curate people through the discomfort of adopting a more critical approach to issues of race, identity, gender, and colonial histories. I challenge and support people through the discomfort necessary in reassessing traditional interpretation, help to reshape curatorial thinking, and create narratives that address the legacies of our history. One could argue that some objects should never have been on show to the morbidly curious in the first place, but people have always had a fascination for the strange or beautiful other. However, times and peoples change, and each othered subject-object should be approached with the compassion and knowledge that we are civilized enough to afford them. Thank you.